Tri-City Sports Now, and I'm Marky Billson. Got home yesterday and history, and so I was saddened to learn that Gino Marchetti, who is an old-time football player, died at the age of 93. Marchetti was of an era, Artie Donovan's era, and Artie Donovan doesn't seem that long ago because Artie Donovan was so, in his post-football career, some disparaging things about Dwayne Thomas, who is not standing for the national anthem. Boy, suddenly Artie Donovan, it seems like he would fit in today. What would he be saying about Colin Kaepernick? But regardless, he was part of a defensive line of the Baltimore Colts that won back-to-back NFL titles. Yeah, there were only 12 teams in the NFL back in those days. It was before the Dallas Cowboys even existed. In fact, the Baltimore Colts were the old Dallas Texans of 1952, team that didn't make it. There are some that actually trace their origins to date. Kind of says, well, you know what, there's some gaps in here, and I mean, there's some little, maybe you shouldn't be doing this here, and all that. But anyway, the Baltimore Colts were the NFL champions in 58 and 59, and had a tremendous Artie Donovan. Gino Marchetti was part of it. Marchetti, like I said, passed away at the age of 93. But I knew Gino Marchetti before I even knew he was a football player. Before I started falling in love with those old NFL films, where Artie Donovan would tell the story about how Don Joyce and Gino Marchetti would involve themselves into a huge eating contest, let's say. Who could win and eat the most pieces of chicken? And the story comes down that they had a bet on it, the old Colts. And because they didn't want the stomachs to fill up, they wouldn't let either Don Joyce, that was the final person of the old defensive line of the Baltimore Colts, or Gino Marchetti, drink anything as they were eating their chicken. And so Marchetti ate 20-odd pieces, and Joyce ate 30-odd. And they finally would then let them wash it down. And Joyce got a big pitcher of iced tea to wash it down. He then reached into his pocket, pulled out a couple of sweetened lows, and drank it down. Sweetened lows. Yeah. After eating 39 pieces of chicken or thereabout, Joyce was still counting his calories. But Marchetti was known a little bit more because he was a restaurateur. And he was known, yes, for fried chicken. This is how I knew Gino Marchetti. I've talked about this. My mom, when my first memories, I guess, well, maybe not my very first, but being a very little boy in a main line of Philly, while my mom was getting her PhD from Bryn Mawr, and she would eventually become a professor at ETSU. And we lived in, Bryn Mawr, mainline towns, Haverford, Ardmore, if you're familiar. The story goes, though, that the big fast food restaurant in that area, though, was not McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's or Hardee's or someplace like that, as fast food was really coming about in the United States. It was, in fact, Gino's. Gino's was a hamburger joint. Kid growing up, you thought that you didn't realize it was a local chain. And also, you didn't realize that it was Gino Marchetti, and frankly, yeah, Gino's, suburban Philly, restaurant started by a former Baltimore Colt. You'd think that it would just be sort of a local Baltimore chain. No, it actually expanded to the three big cities. Marchetti was quite the businessman, and in fact, he had, speaking of chicken, the Kentucky Fried Chicken contract for Philly. There weren't Kentucky Fried Chickens in Philadelphia when I was a kid. They were all a part of Gino's. That was how good of a businessman Gino Marchetti was. Oh, he was a great football player. Like I said, he was on one of the legendary defensive lines of all time. Donovan, Marchetti, Joyce, and Big Daddy Lipscomb. They won 2 straight NFL titles, including the greatest game ever played, supposedly, 1958 NFL championship game, the first one that went into overtime in NFL history. You know the story. Burt Rechichar, by the way, former Tennessee Volunteer, a product not only of the Vols' 1951 national championship team, but also their 1951 College World Series team. So you want to get the local tie in there and all that. But yeah, and I don't know how many people really realize, certainly I didn't, Gino's. I mean, who is Gino? I don't know Gino. Now, don't confuse that with Gino's cheesesteaks on 9th and Passyunk in Philly, which is something of a famous cheesesteak. It's do you want to go to Pat's or do you want to go to Gino's? That sort of thing. No, it was a legitimate, like I said, fast food restaurant. Went there all the time and all that. And that was where you went for Kentucky Fried Chicken if you lived in Philly in the 70s and such, and up until the 80s or so. That was a big restaurant. That was probably the leading, I don't know what the sales were right off the top of my head, but that was one of the Philly, and it was started by Gino Marchetti. And that's how I knew the guy. And yeah, I remember, you get a tea and a hamburger for 88 cents. Okay, now I sound like I'm really someone who's helped establish the NFL to be what it is today. And he was all of those things, but to so many more people, he was a restaurateur. And really one of the first people that would bring, fast food and certainly Kentucky Fried Chicken to not just Baltimore, but to Philly. And that was the amazing thing. Gino's, it's still around. It's had some ups and downs as a chain, I believe. I think that it was revived about 10 years ago in the Philadelphia area. I think they're King of Prussia, which is a famous suburb of Philly. They've got a big mall there and such. Anyway, I think that's where their headquarters is located at, if you're so inclined to perhaps try to invest and bring that to East Tennessee or something. But that's what you knew Gino Marchetti from. It was Gino's Hamburgers. The things that you learn, so there you go. I mentioned that Marchetti played with the former baseball and football legendary Tennessee Volunteer Burt Rechichar, who I also got to know. I did a feature on him in Pittsburgh Post because he's from Western Pennsylvania. Went to what would have been, he went to the high school that Joe Montana would have gone to. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Think of how, Sullivan Central, Sullivan North, and Sullivan South are all going to consolidate into Westview in a couple of years around here. Well, years ago, Ross Draver High School basically became Ringgold High School. So Rechichar went to Ross Draver, and Joe Montana, the legendary. We're tying in Tennessee Volunteer football, Tennessee Volunteer baseball. How about Tennessee Volunteer basketball? Yeah, the big story coming out. This from from the Los Angeles Times, Ben Bolch. He's the beat writer for UCLA, and he's got a big story about the search for UCLA getting a basketball coach. This is UCLA. You could make the argument that's the best program in all of college basketball. Okay, maybe it's yesterday's program, but they do have the most national championships in history. Who wouldn't want to go there? And yeah, you can be a real star using that LA media. Well, John Calipari decided that he'd prefer Kentucky, and things happened with Jamie Dixon, who was from Southern California. He wanted to leave his alma mater and go. So a lot of boosters, when they were looking at back burner candidates, said, what about Rick Barnes over here, the UT head coach? He had Tennessee ranked number 1 for a month. They had only been ranked number 1 in their entire history for a week before then. And so the overture was made to Barnes, but now another wrinkle